In today's video, stories of gorillas in California. The only problem? At the time the stories took place, there were no gorillas in California. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. On a late Indian hunt in the vicinity of Weiser, Idaho, Lieutenant Barker discovered the print of a foot. Not human, and we scarcely think savage, the smallest measurement of which that could be obtained showed a length of 17.5 inches, with the widest breadth of about 7 inches. This short paragraph, printed in the October 26, 1867 issue of the Oregon City Enterprise, may be the earliest newspaper article to refer to the legendary creature which supposedly lurks in the wilds between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific coast: Bigfoot. In fact, the term even appears as the headline for the story, though as two separate words rather than the compound that we use today. Or perhaps the reason for that headline is more related to the man that Lieutenant Barker and his men were hunting, a Paiute war chief by the name of Howlook, known to those who fought against him as Bigfoot. You see, from 1864 to 1868, the United States Army was embroiled in a bitter guerrilla war against an alliance of northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone tribes, referred to by settlers as the Snake Indians, a title derived from the Snake River, which winds through western Idaho and eastern Oregon. Lieutenant Barker's Indian hunt was part of this conflict, and earlier articles in the Idaho Statesman give some further context regarding Barker's activities. One from the October 15th issue explains that Barker's unit left Fort Boise several days prior, having been advised of the presence of a snake warband in the vicinity of the Weiser River. Upon their arrival, they found an empty camp which they assessed to have been abandoned a day or two prior. Baker surmised that they had crossed over the Weiser for the purpose of hunting, and were probably driven out by a severe snowstorm which prevailed there just previous to their departure. But it was in this camp, amongst the tracks and other signs of some 70 or 80 warriors, that one thing stood out. One large track, the paper reads, not human by any means, made in many places, plainly indicated that the famous thief Bigfoot had been living in luxurious ease for some time in that vicinity. I will say I'm not sure whether thief or chief was supposed to be the word printed there, but based on stories about the guy, either one could have worked given who was writing it. Now, the section reprinted in the Oregon City Enterprise is presented in a more sarcastic tone, but it records the same information. These prints were 17.5 inches long and 7 inches wide. But what makes the article so strange is the manner in which this individual is described. Bigfoot is represented as a giant in stature and strength, the author wrote, adding that Bigfoot has been reported killed on 3 or 4 occasions, but it seems the noble child of the forest still lives. The article goes on to say that Bigfoot is noted amongst his brethren for unapproachable skill in using the scalp knife on wicked white people, and then reports a bounty of $50 for the big toe of this babe of the woods, as well as 100 coin for the capture of his scalp. In the same breath, Bigfoot, a known real-life historical figure, is then described as not human by any means and a noble child of the forest, but also as a member of the snake bands, which are called his brethren. The simple explanation here is that the author of the article is being tongue-in-cheek. It's difficult to read the entire article and come to the conclusion that this character is believed to be anything but a human being, with the exception of the line explicitly saying the opposite. Given the tense nature of the situation, however, it seems reasonable to conclude that this is a case of dehumanization of an enemy rather than a confused report about some half-man, half-beast creature of the forest. But that doesn't explain anything about what was reported some 35 years later on January 27, 1902, in the Salt Lake City Tribune. On that date, the paper printed a story out of Chesterfield, Idaho, wherein a group of young people were skating along the Portneuf River near the home of John Gooch, when a hair-covered human monster suddenly sprang out of the timber end upon the party. The creature reportedly held a large stick and made a series of yells before attacking the skaters, who quickly made an escape from their slow-moving assailant. By that time, the Snake War was long finished, and the only mentions of a chief called Bigfoot in the late 1800s seemed to be in reference to a Lakota chief named Spotted Elk, to whom an American soldier had reportedly assigned the nickname. Besides, Chief Howlook was only ever described as large, somewhere around 6.5 feet tall, and even that seems to be a detail added much later as the stories were retold. So whatever this was, if the story is true, it wasn't a war chief, because according to the article, a party of young men returned armed and got a good view of the monster, who by that point was warming himself by the fire they had left. Observing from a safe distance, they surmised the creature to be at least 8 feet high, and found that it was indeed covered with long reddish-brown hair, with its face hidden by immense bushy whiskers, the only bare skin they could see being a small spot above the eyes. Though they could have attempted to kill the newcomer, they opted instead to leave it alone and return the next day to examine whatever it left behind. When the young men returned the following morning, however, they found tracks which reportedly measured 22 inches long by 7 1/4 inches broad, with the imprint of only 4 toes. Now that part, it seems, was actually no surprise. The paper reported that cowboys and other livestock workers had seen similar tracks along the range west of the river. The residents of Chesterfield opted to send some 20 men out looking for the giant, which was trekking westward when it was last seen. But what became of that expedition is hard to say, as their fate doesn't appear to have been reported anywhere. The story itself, however, was reprinted in a number of papers across Idaho and Utah, with varying degrees of credulity. The Silver City Nugget, for example, capped its coverage with the suggestion that Bingham County whiskey could do queer things with a 3-ring political circus and cause it to beget some queer characters of monstrosities. A fair suggestion, but for the fact that the people involved in the story were almost certainly Mormons, and therefore probably not drinking. On the other hand, so far as the papers were concerned, there appear to be no further mentions of the monster or its hunters beyond the reprints of the original story. And while the lack of an update doesn't render the tale fictional, it does serve as a reason to view the story with a degree of skepticism. Surely, if hairy giants were roaming the wilds of Idaho, they would be reported more than once every 35 years. And that's not even taking the fact that Barker's tale is probably more of a propaganda story than anything into account. So, is it safe to say that the Idaho Bigfoot sightings were nothing but tall tales or hoaxes? Not necessarily, because while there certainly weren't many reported sightings in Idaho during that time period, the same was not true of the West as a whole. On October 1st, 1870, the Antioch Ledger printed a rather strange story. At least a week prior, the San Joaquin Republican reported that a wild man had been seen in Crow Canyon near Mount Diablo, whose tracks were 13 inches long. The Ledger's writers were skeptical of the authenticity of the tale, largely because they were unfamiliar with such a canyon, but they did note that a story of the same sort had been published in the Oakland Transcript. F.J. Hildreth and Samuel DeGroot, it began, while out hunting on Orostimba Creek about 3 weeks ago, discovered footprints along the bank of the creek resembling impressions of a human being's feet. And that wouldn't be too odd, but for the fact that the toes in particular were like those of a human being, but with the exception that the impressions of the toes were much larger. And moments later, the reason for the strangeness of the tracks became clear. As Hildreth worked his way further up the creek, he saw, a few yards ahead of him, what he believed to be a gorilla. His partner, DeGroot, claimed to have seen the same creature, and the transcript added that the appearance of these strange animals in that neighborhood is notorious, and that they are gorillas is firmly believed by a great number of people in that community. Of course, gorillas were something of a new discovery at the time, at least so far as those not native to their habitat were concerned, so it's important to establish what the term might have meant to somebody writing in 1870. There weren't any photos of such an animal, so all someone would have to go on would be illustrations. Gorillastrations, if you will. And for many people, they might only have heard a description. Either way, someone would probably not be picturing exactly what you and I think of when somebody uses the word. The gorillas they'd be familiar with were more comfortable on their 2 legs and lighter in color. More important than any of that, however, is the fact that nobody was known to have brought a gorilla to the United States. So what were these men seeing? Unlike the situation in Idaho, where decades took place between reported sightings of wild men, the gorilla sightings in the vicinity of the San Joaquin Valley weren't nearly so sparse. Just weeks after the Ledger published the varying accounts, a reader sent in a letter to the editor in which he recounted his own experience. The author wrote that the Ledger's journalists sneered at the idea of any such critter in these hills, and that were he not better informed, he would too. But he was, in his opinion, better informed, and explained that this gorilla, or wild man, whatever you choose to call it, is no myth. He continued on, adding that he knew it existed, and furthermore there were at least 2 of them, and he'd seen them together within the prior year. But the stories went back farther than that. Their existence has been reported at times for the past 20 years, the author wrote, and as if expecting resistance to his story, he noted that he was aware of a rumor that an orangutan had escaped from a ship at some point in the recent past, but he was certain it was not that animal. And if it was, he continued, where did he get his mate? With that, he launched into his own story of meeting the wild man the previous fall. And if we're to believe this writer, then he was hunting in the mountains about 20 miles south of Grayson, California, as he claimed to have done every year for the previous decade and a half. He'd been in camp for nearly a week, and several times during his trip he'd returned to camp to find the ashes and charred sticks from the fireplace had been scattered around the campsite. After this happened a few times, he decided that it was worth looking into. An old hunter notices these things, he wrote, and very soon gets curious to know the cause. He peered around and found that his bedding and traps and little stores were not disturbed, and the hard-packed ground presented no tracks to indicate what sort of animal was responsible. Anxious to learn who or what it was that so regularly visited his camp, he started in a circle around the place, and some 300 yards from his tent, he came across a set of tracks. They appeared to be those of a man's bare feet, but what struck him was the immense size, of which he gave no specific measurement. Faced with the choice between leaving, ignoring it, or waiting to see if it would come back, he chose the latter option and took a position on a hillside about 60 or 70 feet from the fire and securely hid in the bush. By his estimation, he waited over 2 hours, wondering whether the stranger imagined what interest he had created in his inquiring mind, and finally, what possessed him to be prowling about there with no shoes on. The answer came rather suddenly, heralded by a shrill whistle such as boys produce with 2 fingers under their tongue, which I must say is something I have not at the age of 27 figured out how to do. He quickly shifted to face the direction of the sound and was startled to find something standing by the fire pit. It did not ask if he knew how to get to Bell's Canyon, but it was in the image of man, though it could not have been human. The creature stood only 5 feet tall, with arms that were too long and legs that were too short. The shoulders and chest were too broad, and its disproportionately small head appeared to be set upon his shoulders without a neck. The entire body was covered in dark brown and cinnamon-colored hair, which was quite long in some parts, and with its head hair in a shock and growing down close to the eyes. As the author was observing the stranger and taking all of this in, the thing suddenly threw his head back and whistled again, then stood and grasped a stick from the fire. He then started swinging the stick around until the tip was extinguished, and then he took another stick and did the same thing, repeating the process for about 15 minutes. Now, despite being armed, the author chose not to shoot whatever it was that had disturbed his camp, opting to remain quietly in the bushes until it left. And when it finally did so, it only went a short distance and then returned with a female. The pair then turned and walked back toward and then past the author before disappearing into the brush beyond the campsite. Somewhat dumbfounded, the author perceived that their only object in visiting his camp seemed to be amusing themselves by swinging lighted sticks around. The letter then finished with the simple statement that he'd told this story many times since the incident, and that he had met one other person who had seen the mysterious creatures, along with a dozen who had come across their tracks at various places between Grayson and Pacheco Pass. It seems that nothing else was sent in by this particular writer, but several months later, another story appeared. A gorilla was seen in the Cedar Mountain Range about 20 miles south of Livermore a few nights since, reported the Sacramento Daily Union on January 25th, 1871. So clearly, other people were seeing this gorilla, even though there were no gorillas in California in 1871. But despite the flurry of reports and claims that such things were common topics of discussion, it would be some years before further mentions of strange primates in the mountains appeared in the papers once more. But finally, in August of 1879, the gorilla of the San Joaquin Valley was back in the news. On Saturday, reported the Stockton Independent on August 25th, 1879, we met a gentleman who lives on the west side of the San Joaquin, about 7 miles west of Hills Ferry, who made the following statement: Aiden, the mood lighting. Thank you. While in the Coast Range about 10 days ago hunting, he and his companions encamped on the side of a ravine near the summit of the range. In the morning, they discovered smoke lower down the ravine, and upon going out upon the side of the hill to ascertain the origin of it, they discovered an object which puzzled them to name, and as their curiosity became excited, they crept carefully toward it, in order to satisfy themselves of what kind of animal they had discovered. By creeping on the ground, they were able to approach within 100 yards when, to their astonishment, they found that the object which they had approached with the intention of shooting was a man, perfectly nude, but covered from head to foot with a most remarkable growth of hair. The hair upon his head and beard were very long, reaching to his waist, while his body, arms, and limbs were protected by the same natural covering. Hoping to approach and capture this strange being, they attempted to creep nearer, but he took alarm and rapidly ran away, jumping over the bushes in his path like a deer. The two gentlemen decided to remain and camp in the same locality the second night, and they were again rewarded by the sight of the strange being. They were awakened in the night by a sound resembling that caused by striking flint upon steel, and upon advancing in the direction of the sound, they saw the same object, who appeared to be striking two flint rocks together. On their approach, he again took alarm and ran away. We have heard reports of a wild man in that vicinity for several years past, but the gentleman who makes this statement is the only one we have ever seen who vouches for the truth of the reports. The gentleman is well known to us, and he asserted that he and his companion were willing to make an oath to the truth of the statement. The odd last statement about this being the only time someone has vouched for the truth of the report notwithstanding, because everyone who reported this over the years claimed it was true, it's quite similar to the story sent into the Ledger, though not without important differences. For example, the story in the Ledger was of something that sounded far more like a chimpanzee with a bowl cut than a man, while the latter story plainly describes a human being with long hair and a beard. On the other hand, both stories agree that the entire body was covered in hair, and both do describe a degree of tool use, but the proportions would suggest that these were not the same creature and/or person. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be seen again for nearly a decade, and when stories re-emerged, the locale had shifted somewhat to the north. The wild man was now haunting Sacramento. On March 3rd of 1888, the Sacramento Bee published an article entitled "The Strange Animal Which Startled a Brighton Woodchopper." And according to Mr. P. Burns of the aforementioned community of Brighton, an employee of his named Brooks was working by the American River when he was suddenly confronted by an animal of strange appearance, which was about 4.5 feet in height, walked erect, and was covered with long black hair. The creature was apparently as startled as the man who saw it, as it quickly retreated into the dense thickets skirting the river. And as for what Brooks perceived it to be, his best guess was a large ape or a gorilla, and in that case, likely one that had escaped from a menagerie, or alternatively, it could have been some human deformity. Mr. Burns apparently intended to send a hunting party in search of the mysterious creature, but nothing more of it was said in the weeks which followed, or even the following few years. But in 1891, another story appeared, this time in the mountains to the west of the city. It is reported today that a strange creature, much resembling a gorilla, has been seen in the hills adjacent to the Capay Valley, reported the San Francisco Call in early April of 1891. This time, the mystery being was described as much taller than that seen in Sacramento, standing at over 6 feet when erect, and that detail was relevant because, according to witnesses, the creature traveled on all fours, climbed trees, and had wonderful strength in his hands. In addition, it was said to be covered in shaggy hair, and while no sources for the story were named, the paper asserted that the story is vouched for by more than one responsible man, and that once again, a hunt was to be organized in hopes of capturing the thing. As usual, however, there was no report on what, if anything, the hunt revealed, but that wasn't the end of the story. You see, just a week later, on April 17th, the Evening News out of San Jose reported that a gentleman registered at a hotel in this city yesterday as being from Woodland had a very strange story to tell of a recent adventure in the vicinity of Woodland. As the mysterious gentleman speaking on the condition of anonymity told it, about a week prior to his interview, he had been hunting and fishing in the hills adjacent to the Capay Valley. This confirmed it to be the same sighting as that reported by the Call, and this time there were more details. While wading across a small stream, the article continued, the hunter's attention was called to a movement in a small timber and brush a short distance from the bank of the stream. When he turned to look, he saw a frightful object emerge from the brush. The strange creature resembled a huge gorilla in form, with hair that was quite thick and long and covered the entire body with the exception of the face, the skin of which was nearly white and all the features closely resembled those of a human being. And most notably, the resemblance was much closer than the observer had ever noticed in the features of an ape or a gorilla. So this creature was, as far as the witness was concerned, too ape to be a man, and yet too man to be an ape. Whatever it was repulsive and startling to the beholder, who stood rooted to the spot with fright. Yet the hairy ape man before him paid him no mind. Instead, it simply drank from the creek and then swiftly returned to the woods, where the hunter saw the animal climb a tree like a cat and swing itself from limb to limb with wonderful agility. Once again, these were all ape-like characteristics, and yet that human face left him deeply perturbed. In closing the interview, the Evening News continued, the gentleman expressed it as his firm belief that the strange creature was not a gorilla. And that article also ended with the claim that a hunt was to take place, but it appears that no follow-up was published. So the origin and the fate of the California wild man, it seems, was to remain a mystery. But of the Oregon wild man, there was more to be said. On Sunday, September 21st, 1890, the Sunday Oregonian reported that a man by the name of J.W. Terry had made a peculiar discovery. In a deep canyon near Pendleton, the man reportedly came across a skull which bore a very slight resemblance to that of a man, beside which it was compared. The holes for the eyes and nose were in the proper place, but the skull was unusually thick, apparently an inch or more in some places, and from every appearance belonged to some very powerful and formidable-looking animal. It was to be sent to the Smithsonian for analysis, but once again, if anything further came of it, I've been unable to locate the reports. But whatever this thing was, the real question was whether or not it was related to what was going on over 300 miles away in the southwestern corner of the state. You see, 4 years prior, a correspondent for the Del Norte Record sent in a story from the Happy Camp area in Siskiyou County, California. And according to the writer, a trustworthy local man by the name of Jack Dover had recently been out hunting when he came across something strange. About 150 yards from him, he saw an object picking berries or tender shoots from the bushes. The object in question was, as he described it, of gigantic size, about 7 feet high, with a bulldog head, short ears, and long hair. But while it was certainly much taller than the average man, it was not as hairy as the other wild men described at the time. Instead, it was hairless everywhere that a man should be, while possessing a full head of hair and a beard, but nothing else. And another startling aspect was the thing's voice. Where one might expect such a large person to produce a deep, booming tone, this creature's was a shrill or soprano and very human, like that of a woman in great fear. Now, Mr. Dover reportedly aimed his gun at the animal, or whatever it was, several times, but because it was so human, he would not shoot. The last thing that was said of it, besides Dover being one of several men to report it, was that it is apparently herbivorous and makes winter quarters in some of the caves of Marble Mountain. Now, if you've seen our previous episodes on Bigfoot in Native American storytelling, this might sound familiar to things like the Yurok Indian Devil, or the Saskets, or the Sayatics, that live in this exact same area. But all of the major sightings of this sort of cluster here in southwestern Oregon, northwestern California, came at the turn of the century and concentrated around a mining operation along Sixes River in southwestern Oregon. The first of these came in 1889 with a report made by Fred Foster and Bert Wasson based on stories that they'd been told by the miners while they had been prospecting in the Rusty Creek area. According to Foster and Wasson, a group of miners had been out prospecting and, becoming tired and hungry, had come in for their noonday meal. As they approached camp, their ears were greeted by unearthly cries and a lively rattle of cooking utensils, and upon reaching their destination, they were almost paralyzed at the sight that greeted them. Jumping around the camp like a kangaroo and moving with swift and lightning-like speed was a hairy animal that resembled a man in some respects. The hair of its head was long and brown and cascaded down to below the waist, with a foot-long beard to match, but most strikingly, it had a tail some 14 inches long. They decided they would attempt to catch it and opted to encircle the camp and approach from all sides at once. But when they were just 100 feet or so from their target, it made off with blazing speed, coming close enough for a miner named Bob to grasp its tail, yet he was unable to hold on to it and thus the creature escaped. "Too bad, Bob," wrote a rather smug Mr. Eckley of the Coquille City Herald. "If you had succeeded in capturing that kangaroo, man, it would have made you a fortune." Now, Eckley's skepticism wasn't unwarranted. Miners, loggers, and other such deep wilderness workers of the day were renowned for their tales of the fearsome critters they encountered during long periods in the wilderness. Many such stories were even published, though with the explicit understanding by those telling them that they were fiction, even if those city slickers reading them might not be aware. And in this instance, the story seemed so silly and was transmitted in such an indirect manner that one can forgive a journalist for viewing it with some doubt. But it wasn't the last such story to come about. 2 years after the report by Foster and Wasson, another account of a sighting was published in the Ashland, Oregon-based Valley Record, this time out of the Waldo area down on the California border. The wild man is now the leading topic along the Klamath, the article began, continuing on to say that reports have it that the great and mysterious giant has once more come out of his den in the woods and presented his gigantic form to the gaze of man. This time, the creature was not 6 or 7 feet tall, but a remarkable 9 feet tall at least, with tracks that measured 18 inches long and also appeared to have 7 toes. In addition, it was able to jump 15 feet through 3-foot deep snow, and when it spotted its observers, the thing threw up its arms, stood and gazed around, and began vigorously pulling at its grizzled beard. Then, with a hideous yell, he fled and vanished. And while the writer of the article believed it more likely that it was the hunters who fled with alarm, he did not doubt the authenticity of the story, as, according to him, we know the reputation for veracity of these hunters, and we can vouch for its authenticity. For several years to come, the wild man or kangaroo man would regularly make the news. In August of 1901, it was spotted in the mountains of Curry County by J.F. Tanner and George B. Wasson, who stumbled right into a natural camping place where the indications pointed to recent camping and where a large amount of fragments of meat and bones and carcasses of animals were found. There were no traces that a fire had been made, and no signs of any meat or bones having been cooked. The bed was made of leaves and other brush, with the imprint of a man pressed into it, leading them to believe that it had been used for that purpose for some time. So this, they believed, must have been a camp of the wild man. Now, strikingly, the imprint in the bed suggested the creature which slept there was 7.5 feet tall, and in addition to the bones and bed were massive tracks measuring 16 inches long by 8 inches wide. But this time there was a twist. The wild man seemed to have been wearing shoes. There were many signs that the wild man must be accompanied by another, continued the story, there being a smaller track and indications that it was that of a woman. Several hand marks were seen at the spring where the imprints of both large and small hands had been left in the mud, presumably made while drinking. The evidences of the cannibalistic feasting on raw flesh, the footprints, the imprints of the hands of 2 sizes, all go to show that there are 2 individuals. This was apparently of little concern to the 2 men, who camped for the night not far from this place, though it was of enough concern that it was a night of restlessness, and even the dogs seemed uneasy. Unfortunately, the wild man made no appearance during the night, though a keen lookout was kept all the time with a hope of getting sight of them. Prospectors seem to have had conflicting feelings about whether or not they actually wanted to see the thing, the fear of being vanquished by the wild couple apparently balanced by the romance of a probable capture of the wild man and possibly the woman. The following day, they made another discovery, a cave which the couple had used for a place of abode during inclement weather, which possessed indications of a regular headquarters. Specifically, there were just so very many bones, and all meat, the article clarified, had been handled by the hand of man. The prospectors left quickly, despite being undaunted by the sight and wishful that they could stay and do battle with the wild people, but they had only a short time to make it home, so they very reluctantly left the trail of the wild people. Like all the others, they too planned to make another trip into that country sometime in the future, when they would stay 6 months. But if it ever happened, it would appear that it didn't make the papers, nor did any real news of this strange creature, at least until 1904. The appearance of the wild man of the Sixes has thrown some of the miners into a state of excitement and fear, reported the Daily Capital Journal out of Salem, Oregon on March 30th, 1904. And according to that article, the wild man had been seen 3 times since early February, with the first being in a place called Thompson Flat. There, a William Ward and a young man named Burlinson were sitting by the fire of their cabin one night when they heard something outside the cabin which resembled a man walking. As they sat listening, whatever it was approached, and when it came to the corner of the cabin, it took hold of that corner and gave the building a vigorous shake, and kept up a frightful noise all the time, the same that has so many times warned the venturesome miners of the approach of the hairy man and caused them to flee in abject fear. Once he regained his resolve, Mr. Ward walked to the cabin door and could see the monster plainly as it walked away, and took a shot at it with his rifle, but the bullet went wild off its mark. Now, it didn't trouble them after that, but it did return. While the second occasion on which the wild man appeared wasn't detailed in the report, the final one had occurred just a few days earlier by the cabin of a man called Harrison. Ward was actually there when it happened, and again figured in the excitement. It was early in the morning, around 5 o'clock, when the wild man gave the door of the cabin a vigorous shaking, which aroused Ward and one of the Harrison boys. They quickly grabbed their rifles and began to fire at the wild man, who answered by sending a 4-pound rock at Ward's head, but his aim was just a little too high. Following that, the stranger scampered off into the brush and disappeared. Finally, the article closed with the following statement, wrapping up most of what had been reported over the previous half-decade into a short summary. Many of the miners avow that the wild man is a reality. They have seen him and know whereof they speak. They say he is something after the fashion of a gorilla and unlike anything else in appearance or action. He can outrun or jump anything else that has ever been known, and not only that, but he can throw rocks with wonderful force and accuracy. He is about 7 feet high, has broad hands and feet, and his body is covered by a prolific growth of hair. In short, he looks like the very devil. And nearly 20 years later, a very similar story will be told of an event by Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens in a place now known as Ape Canyon. Now, what I find particularly interesting about some of these stories, not necessarily all of them, is how well they do line up with the stories that came out of the Klamath River Native American tribes, and how those in turn are so similar to things coming out of places like the Cascades and the Olympic Mountains and Vancouver Island all the way up into British Columbia. You know, at a time where the relationship between the white population and the native population in California was extremely contentious, often very adversarial, you see these stories from both sides that are describing much the same thing. Is it possible that they were transmitting these stories between one another somehow? Yes, and it's also possible that the natives had told the Spanish and the Spanish told the Americans. But what I think is very interesting is that if you look at the 1924 stuff with the Battle of Ape Canyon, if you look at the 1958 stuff with the incidents at Bluff Creek, you see a lot of references to old Indian stories. You know, there are these old Indian tales of these creatures that exist out here. But you don't see that in the 1800s material. It is hunters going out and being like, yeah, I've seen this and so has everybody else I know. Which, granted, is exactly how the modern-day Bigfoot community is. And that's not to take a shot at the Bigfoot community. If anything, I actually think that this speaks to the veracity of these stories. Because today, you have a ton of people who live in an era where it's really easy to lie. It's really easy to make things up and to do it for clout. But if you look at the Bigfooter community, for the most part, a lot of these people are very sincere. They genuinely believe they've experienced this. They want to find the truth, and they're not trying to, in my experience, it doesn't seem like they're trying to, prove everybody wrong necessarily. They just see this as a real thing that people should know about. There are, of course, those that are gonna, kind of like, I want to be able to say, I told you so. But for the most part, it seems like a genuine group of people. And I think if you got people like that today, when there's a lot more skepticism, a lot more cynicism about the unknown, I'm willing to believe that people 150 years ago felt the same way. That's not to say that I genuinely believe these people saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever we want to call it, so to speak. But for those who haven't been watching this series, maybe this is the first time you've seen me talk about Bigfoot, I'm very much trying to keep an open mind with this one. I don't necessarily agree that there is some giant undiscovered primate living off in America's forests that science has somehow managed to miss all this time while finding things like the mountain gorilla. Because let's be realistic, if we can find mountain gorillas, you would expect that we'd be able to find Bigfoot. But personally, I see the Bigfoot story as maybe a remnant of a lost tribe or something along those lines. And at the same time, if somebody were to present me with incontrovertible evidence that Bigfoot is in fact real, well, it would be incontrovertible evidence, and therefore I would believe it. But as of right now, I don't believe that Bigfoot is responsible for the missing 411 phenomenon. I don't believe that there are, giant ape families just roaming around that somehow we have yet to catalog. But I'm willing to sit there and say, all right, bring me proof and I'll go along with it. When you've got this many stories about something that spread across, at the very least, the entire Pacific Northwest, you have all the different Native American tribes talking about it. You got these settlers who come in. And we don't know if they had heard these stories the natives had, but when they get there, they're telling stories very similar to those that the natives had during a time when the relationship was adversarial. And then, 30, 40 years later, you get into the 1920s, and people start making the connection. They go, wait a second, let's actually talk to the natives. What do they think? What are their stories? What do they know? How does it compare to what we know? And that's kind of what spins up this modern Bigfoot phenomenon, I guess you could say, is this realization that these stories aren't new. It's not loggers and prospectors who came up with this and suddenly saw it. There are a couple hundred years of backing to this, potentially even more. And then you've got the hairy man petroglyphs down in Southern California that are very ancient and appear to show Bigfoot. Is it Bigfoot, as in the Patterson-Gimlin film Bigfoot? I don't think so. I think that film is a hoax. I don't know if Patterson and Gimlin even knew it was a hoax, but I think it was. You can disagree with me on that if you want. I do plan on getting to a video really going through the Patterson-Gimlin film and trying to diagnose it, looking at all the different arguments, and of course having my resident NYU film grad who functions as producer and co-host, maybe do a segment on his opinion on this film. So if you want to help us do stuff like that, if you enjoy these videos going into, I guess, the anthropology of Bigfoot almost, the history of Bigfoot, then the best thing that you can do is support our channel by subscribing to our Patreon. We offer it for just $1 a month. There are exclusive episodes of a show called Liquored Lore over there where we imbibe and then, we do this, but we do it live. It's not live because we tried that once and it did not go well. Knocked over a wall, I broke a tripod, Aiden talked for 4 hours, my girlfriend was mad. A lot happened. We don't do those live anymore. We don't do those live anymore. But, for example, if you go on Patreon right now, if you're seeing this on the day it premieres, Liquored Lore is up, and it's not only up, it's an episode with Stephen Bell from Stakuyi and History of Everything, and he's actually part of our new channel, History Unhinged. If you head over to History Unhinged here on YouTube, what you will see, not quite yet, but in January when it launches, you're going to get, if you've ever seen the Unsubscribed podcast, it's kind of like that, but with history. It's me, Stephen Bell, Roman Helmet Guy, and Thornbury over here, just starting off with a topic. I wanted these to be structured, but I'm not in charge.
You can't have a show called History Unhinged and expect it to be structured.
I know. So basically, it's two historians, a history content creator, and then this poor guy over here, just going at it about history. What are the events we covered so far? We have the Crusades. Was the American Revolution justified? What else did we have? Was the British Empire justified? Was part of that episode.
If you went back to ancient Rome, the time of Caesar specifically, what would you do in order to not have them kill you?
Oh, yeah, right. I don't think it was...
Succeed.
Yeah, it was what would you bring with you to succeed? What would you tell people? Yeah, just a bunch of cool hypotheticals, alternate history, funny things that happened, those kinds of things. So that channel is History Unhinged, and that content is launching in January of 2025. If you're seeing this after January of 2025, it's there, go get it. Now, if you still want even more lodge than Patreon/YouTube membership, you can join by clicking a little button under this video. But if you want more than that gets you, you can go over to the Weird Bible, where we have a show with Wendigoon, where we talk about weird stuff from the Bible. It's not a show for Christians. It's not a show for atheists. It's a show by Christians for people interested in what Christianity is. It's not preachy. It's got pop culture references. I somehow managed to work a Lord of the Rings reference in every single time, and it drives Isaiah crazy. If you want to get a good idea of what the show is, I recommend watching the Samson episode first, because that's going to be the easiest transition into it, and it's also very funny. And in 2025, that show will also be live at 7 p.m. on Thursday nights, the last Thursday of every month. We are also going to be adding another show to it that is going to be sort of a discussion format where I will be sitting down with a panel of priests and reverends from various different Christian sects to ask them what their sect believes about particularly contentious topics within the faith, historical episodes, things that, is this metaphor? Is this supposed to be understood literally? Just to get an idea of what each sect of Christianity believes and hopefully foster some kinds of, really cool discussions about it. And on those, you'll probably also have a little segment from me giving the historical context when necessary. And the last of our current programs that we have is, of course, the live show, The Lore Lads, which we do every Monday night at 7 p.m. unless we don't. Aiden, did you happen to put anything up saying we weren't going to do it tonight?
Thank you.
But anyway, that show is usually 7 p.m. on Monday. That is Eastern Time, and it's every Monday unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll tell you. And if you want to get updates about that, they will go up on YouTube, but the first place any update ever goes is Discord, and you can join that by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge. Now, of course, my favorite way to support the channel is to do it with merch and or coffee. We have both. Our coffee is from Tableau Roasting Company down in Lexington, Kentucky. It is a small batch roastery that we worked with very closely to design a coffee. And I was a barista for many years. I know what I'm doing, I promise you. It's the coffee I drink every day. I am a coffee snob, and that is my go-to coffee. I wanted something that was gonna be mild enough that you could drink it how you like it. If you want cream and sugar, cool. If you want cream, cool. Flavoring, whatever, do your thing. But also sophisticated enough to drink black. For me, it really depends on what time of day it is. I usually like black coffee in the middle of the day, and then I'll like to have cream and sugar at night and in the morning. And then, of course, you can also get our merch. You can get one of these guys. This is from Bunker Branding. It's made in America. It's cozy. It's comfy. It's designed by us and Bunker. I mean, you can wear our skin almost. And of course, we have this in the new Lore Lodge logo that started in 2024. There's also a reinforced version of the classic logo. If you have one of our old shirts, it was a little thin on the antlers and started to peel. This one is thicker. And then, of course, there is the Lift Lodge, which is basically the old logo with a barbell in the mouth. And then there is the Redacted Media shirt. That is our parent company, which is also owned by us. And yeah, that one's OD green. It's a little more military styled, but I like it. I think that's everything. So if you haven't liked the video, I assume if you're still here, you must have. So you must have enjoyed it. So if you can hit the like button, I would appreciate it. That would be helpful. I'm being very sincere right now. This time of year is rough. The algorithm gods do not like us in December, except for when we did the MH370 video. Then they really liked us. That was November, though. Yeah, okay, cool. Awesome. All right, well, I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.